He was drowning in debt, his law career slipping through his fingers when a wealthy widow offered him a way out, a contract sealed with marriage, money, and secrets. Malcolm thought he was escaping his past, but instead, he walked straight into a deadly trap. His new wife, Victoria Blackwell, wasn't just generous, she was dangerous. Her late husband's murder was no accident, and Malcolm's own father was tangled in the crime. Now, with his freedom, future, and life on the line, he has one shot to outsmart the woman who holds all the power before she silences him for good. Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe, because tomorrow there's a special surprise you won't want to miss. The eviction notice stared back at Malcolm Carter like a silent execution order. The ink was crisp, the message unforgiving: pay in full or vacate in 7 days. His stomach clenched as he folded the paper and shoved it into his jacket pocket, as if hiding it could make it disappear. It wouldn't. Neither would the student loan notices, the unpaid tuition balance, or the growing weight of disappointment pressing against his chest. He had worked too damn hard to end up like this, broke, drowning, and out of options. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but Malcolm felt like a ghost wandering through it. His law school classmates were already securing internships, mapping out their futures, while he was dodging calls from bill collectors. He needed a way out, something, anything, to keep from falling into the same abyss that had swallowed his father. That was when his phone buzzed. A message from Chris, his only real friend at school. Big opportunity tonight. Blackwell Foundation Gala. You need to be there. Suit up. Malcolm sighed. The Blackwell Foundation was one of the most powerful philanthropic organizations in the city, catering to politicians, business moguls, and legal elites. He had no business stepping into a room filled with people who wouldn't even glance his way. But Chris was right. If there was ever a chance to pull himself out of this mess, it was by making the right connections. Hours later, Malcolm stood outside the towering glass building hosting the gala, adjusting his borrowed suit. Inside, the room gleamed with chandeliers and whispered wealth, the kind of luxury that felt untouchable. He moved through the crowd, trying to ignore the sinking feeling that he didn't belong. Then, he saw her, Victoria Blackwell, the widow, the enigma. She was older, but exuded a presence that made men twice her size step aside. Dressed in an emerald gown, she was poised, untouchable, until her eyes landed on Malcolm, and then she smiled. It was slow, deliberate. "You're different," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. Malcolm hesitated. "Different how? You're not looking to impress. You're looking for a way out." His pulse quickened. "And what do you think you can offer?" Victoria leaned in, her voice low and smooth. "Everything." The way she said it sent a shiver through him. He had been expecting a job lead, maybe an internship, but there was something else behind her gaze. Something deeper, dangerous. "You don't even know me," Malcolm said carefully. Victoria chuckled, tilting her glass. "Oh, but I do. Malcolm Carter, brilliant mind, burdened by debt, a father who was once a force in the legal world, until he wasn't." She took a slow sip of wine. "Tell me, Malcolm, what would you sacrifice to be free?" The air between them felt razor thin. Malcolm should have walked away, but instead he asked, "What are you offering?" Victoria smiled. "Marriage." Malcolm stared at her, waiting for the punchline. The room around them continued to buzz with laughter and clinking glasses, but in that moment everything else faded. He searched Victoria's face for a hint of amusement, some sign that she was toying with him, but her expression remained calm, confident, deadly serious. "You're joking," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Not at all," Victoria replied smoothly, placing her empty wine glass on a passing server's tray. "You need security. I need companionship, or at least the illusion of it. We help each other." Malcolm exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's insane. You don't even know me." "But I do," she countered, her gaze pinning him in place. "You're drowning, Malcolm. One more missed payment and your dream of becoming a lawyer is over. You think those scholarships are enough? You think working yourself to death in that law library will save you? It won't." Malcolm clenched his jaw. She wasn't wrong, but the way she spoke, the certainty in her voice, unsettled him. Victoria leaned in, lowering her voice. "I was married to Jonathan Blackwell for 20 years. His death left me with more money than I'll ever need, but it also left me with responsibilities, ones I'd rather not handle alone. The vultures are circling, Malcolm. I need someone by my side, a husband." His pulse pounded in his ears. "And what do I get in return?" Victoria smiled. "Everything. Your debts, gone. Tuition, handled. Your future, secure. You'd have wealth, connections, power." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You wouldn't just survive, you'd thrive." It was an impossible offer. A lifeline wrapped in silk and steel. "And what's the catch?" he asked. Victoria chuckled softly. You're a law student. I expected you to ask that. Let's just say, discretion is required. My world isn't always straightforward, Malcolm, but I assure you, as long as you remain loyal, you'll have nothing to worry about. There it was, the fine print, the unspoken warnings woven between the tempting promises. Malcolm swallowed. And if I say no? Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then you go back to your life as it is now. You scrape by, fight for every inch, and pray you don't lose everything before you even get a chance to begin. She stepped closer, her perfume intoxicating. But we both know you don't want that, do you? He should have walked away. He should have laughed in her face and told her he wasn't that desperate, but he was. Malcolm glanced around the lavish ballroom, at the men in tailored suits, the women, draped in diamonds, the kind of world that would never let someone like him in, unless someone like Victoria opened the door. He looked back at her, at the woman who held his future between manicured fingers. His throat was dry when he finally spoke. When do we start? The wedding was swift, clinical, more of a transaction than a celebration. No family, no friends, just a legal document and a signature binding Malcolm to a woman he barely knew. The vows felt hollow. The kiss at the altar rehearsed, but none of it mattered. The ink dried, the deal was sealed, and just like that, Malcolm Carter was no longer a struggling law student. He was Malcolm Blackwell, husband of one of the wealthiest women in the city. Victoria wasted no time integrating him into her world. Their new life unfolded in a blur of luxury. Private drivers, high-end suits tailored to his frame, whispered greetings from staff who had been serving the Blackwell estate for decades. The penthouse they shared was breathtaking, perched above the city with walls of glass that made Malcolm feel like he was floating over a world that had once ignored him. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about money. His tuition was paid in full, his debts erased with a single wire transfer. Victoria's lawyers handled everything with ruthless efficiency, ensuring Malcolm's financial resurrection was absolute. He had power, prestige, things he had only dreamed about. And yet, something felt wrong. At first, it was subtle. The way Victoria's staff barely looked him in the eye, the hushed voices that fell silent whenever he entered a room, the locked doors in their penthouse, rooms Victoria never spoke of, doors she never explained. Then there was Victoria herself. She was attentive, charming in public, the perfect wife to a man she barely knew. But behind closed doors there was an edge to her, an unspoken weight in every conversation. She asked questions but never revealed much about herself. When Malcolm tried to bring up her late husband, she would smile, brush his hair back, and change the subject. Jonathan was my past, she said one evening as they sat in their grand dining room. You're my future. Isn't that all that matters? Malcolm wanted to believe her. He wanted to let go of the unease creeping into his mind. But then he found the photograph. It was tucked away in the study, half buried under a stack of old newspapers. A picture of Jonathan Blackwell, tall, broad-shouldered, confident. Standing beside him was Malcolm's father. His heart pounded as he traced his fingers over the faded image. His father had never spoken about Jonathan Blackwell, never mentioned any connection to the Blackwell Foundation. Yet there they were, standing side by side, not as strangers, but as men who knew each other well. He turned the photograph over. There was a date scrawled in blue ink, 3 months before Jonathan Blackwell's death. A chill ran down Malcolm's spine. This marriage wasn't just about power. Victoria Blackwell had chosen him for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it had started long before he ever met her. Malcolm couldn't shake the image from his mind. His father and Jonathan Blackwell standing together like old colleagues, maybe even friends. It didn't make sense. His father had never spoken about working with the Blackwells, never once mentioned the connection. If anything, he had always warned Malcolm about the corruption of the elite, the way power twisted the law into something unrecognizable. So why had he been standing next to one of the most powerful men in the city just months before his death? He needed answers. Late that night, after Victoria had gone to bed, Malcolm slipped into the study, closing the door behind him as quietly as possible. The Blackwell estate was filled with secrets. He could feel them pressing in on him from every angle. He ran, his fingers along the bookshelves, searching for anything that might give him a thread to pull. Then he found it, a locked drawer in Victoria's desk. His pulse quickened. He had no key, but law school had taught him enough about locks to know they weren't invincible. He grabbed a paperclip from the desk, straightened it, and worked it into the mechanism. It took longer than expected. His hands shook, his breath came short, but after a few tense moments he heard the click. The drawer slid open. Inside was a manila folder labeled with his father's name. His chest tightened as he pulled it out, his hands clammy. He flipped it open, scanning the first page. A contract. It was dated 15 years ago, signed by both Jonathan Blackwell and his father. The language was dense, legal jargon wrapped around a single, unmistakable truth. His father had been working for Blackwell, and whatever he had done, it had been buried deep. Malcolm's heart pounded as he flipped through the pages. There were notes scribbled in the margins, a signature at the bottom of each page. Then, toward the end of the file, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. A termination agreement, dated just days before Jonathan Blackwell's death. His father had tried to cut ties. A cold sweat broke over Malcolm's skin. His father had left the Blackwells right before Jonathan had died. Was that a coincidence? Or was there something more? "You shouldn't be in here." Malcolm spun, his stomach lurching. Victoria stood in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, her face shadowed in the dim light. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep his expression neutral. "I couldn't sleep." Her eyes flicked to the folder in his hands. Slowly, she stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Your father was a very complicated man," she said, her voice smooth, unreadable. "I was wondering when you'd start asking questions." Malcolm's fingers tightened around the paper. Victoria smiled, but there was something cold in her eyes. "Careful where you dig, love," she murmured. "You might not like what you find." Malcolm didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Victoria's warning looping in his mind like a slow, menacing whisper. "Careful where you dig." It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it was close enough to make his skin crawl. The next morning, Victoria acted as if nothing had happened. Over breakfast, she discussed an upcoming gala, casually mentioning which politicians and CEOs would be in attendance, but Malcolm barely heard her. His mind was on the folder, the contract, the fact that his father had been involved with the Blackwells right up until the moment Jonathan died. "You're quiet today," Victoria said, sipping her tea. "Something on your mind?" Malcolm forced a smile. "Just thinking about school." Victoria studied him for a moment, her gaze sharper than he would have liked. Then, just as quickly, she smiled and set down her cup. "Don't overwork yourself," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "You have everything you need now. No need to stress." Her touch was warm, but Malcolm felt ice in his veins. Later that afternoon, while Victoria was out at a board meeting, Malcolm returned to the study. He had to be smarter this time. He wouldn't make the mistake of getting caught. He searched through Victoria's files again, but the folder with his father's name was gone. She had moved it. His stomach tightened. She was watching him. Instead of panicking, he shifted his focus. If his father had worked for Jonathan Blackwell, someone else had to know about it. He grabbed his phone and stepped out onto the penthouse balcony, dialing Chris, his only real friend left from law school. "Man, it's been a minute," Chris answered. "How's married life?" Malcolm didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need a favor." Chris sighed. "Of course you do. I need you to dig into Jonathan Blackwell's old business dealings. Anything that connects him to my father." There was a pause. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." Chris exhaled. "This isn't some minor case, Malcolm. This is Blackwell money. If there's something buried, it's buried deep. Just look." Malcolm pressed. "See what you can find." Chris muttered a curse but agreed before hanging up. Malcolm slid his phone into his pocket and turned to go back inside, only to find Victoria standing in the doorway, watching him, his breath caught. How long had she been there? "You should be careful about the company you keep," she said, her voice light, but the weight behind it unmistakable. Malcolm kept his expression neutral. "Chris is just an old friend." Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Let's keep it that way." She turned and walked away, leaving Malcolm standing there, heart pounding, a chilling certainty settling into his bones. She knows, and if he wasn't careful, she'd make sure he never found out the truth. Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being monitored. The Blackwell estate, once a palace of luxury, now felt like a gilded prison. Every step he took, every phone call he made, every question he asked, it all seemed to echo back to Victoria. She didn't confront him outright, but the message was clear. She was always watching. Chris called 2 days later. His voice was tight, his usual sarcasm nowhere to be found. "You need to get out of there," he said. Malcolm's grip tightened on his phone. "What did you find?" Chris hesitated. "Your father didn't just work for Jonathan Blackwell, he was building a case against him. Fraud, money laundering, maybe worse. But the case disappeared. There's nothing in the system. No court records, no police files. It's like someone wiped it clean." A cold sensation curled in Malcolm's stomach. "Victoria, yeah, and here's the part that should really scare you," Chris continued. "Your father dropped everything right before Jonathan died. It's like he knew something was coming and backed off." Malcolm's pulse pounded in his ears. His father had walked away from the Blackwells, but why? Had he realized the danger too late? Had he been silenced? "I need more," Malcolm said. "There has to be something left." "There is," Chris said carefully, "but you're not gonna like it." Silence stretched between them. Victoria was the prime suspect in Jonathan's death. Malcolm felt the world tilt beneath him. There was an autopsy, Chris went on. His death was ruled a heart attack, but there were rumors, whispers of foul play. No one could prove anything, and the case was buried under money and influence. But Malcolm, people knew. His hands trembled as he pressed the phone to his ear. Are you telling me my wife killed her last husband? Chris hesitated. I'm telling you, a lot of people think she did. And if she did, you need to ask yourself one question. Why did she marry you? The line went dead. Malcolm sat there, gripping the phone, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He turned slowly, his gaze landing on Victoria, standing in the doorway. You look troubled, love, she said, stepping inside, her silk robe flowing behind her. He forced himself to stay calm, to breathe evenly. Just a stressful day. Victoria approached him, tilting her head, studying him the way a predator studies its prey. Then she reached out, cupping his face. Her touch was soft, affectionate. You don't have to worry about anything, she murmured. You're safe with me. Malcolm swallowed hard. For the first time, he wasn't sure if that was a promise or a warning. Malcolm had never felt fear like this before. It wasn't the kind that came with being broke or failing a class. It was primal, suffocating, the kind that whispered you might not make it out of this alive. He lay in bed that night, listening to Victoria's steady breathing beside him, his body tense, his mind racing. If she had killed Jonathan, if she had buried his father's case, then what was he to her? A pawn? A liability? A future corpse? He needed to get out. The next morning, he played the role of the doting husband, kissing Victoria's cheek, listening to her discuss some upcoming legal board meeting. But as soon as she left, Malcolm grabbed his phone and called Chris. We need to meet, Malcolm said. Chris exhaled. This isn't safe, man. I don't have a choice, Malcolm whispered, glancing toward the security cameras in the hallway. She's watching me. Chris hesitated, then gave him a location, a coffee shop, far from the Blackwell estate. Malcolm left without telling anyone, moving quickly, every step feeling like he was walking a tightrope over open flames. By the time he got to the cafe, Chris was already there, eyes scanning the room like a man expecting trouble. Malcolm slid into the seat across from him, lowering his voice. I think she killed Jonathan, Malcolm said. Chris's jaw clenched. I think she might kill you too. Malcolm leaned in. I need proof. I need a way to take her down before she takes me down first. Chris pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table. Everything I could find. It's not much, but there's one thing that stood out. A sealed deposition from one of Jonathan's former associates. It was locked behind so many legal barriers that someone really didn't want it getting out. Malcolm pocketed the flash drive. I'll look at it tonight. Chris hesitated. You sure you want to go back there? Malcolm's throat tightened. I don't have a choice, but he should have known better. When Malcolm returned to the penthouse, the air felt different, thicker, charged. He stepped inside and froze. Victoria was waiting, a glass of red wine in her hand, a gun resting on the table beside her. His blood ran cold. Malcolm, she said, voice smooth, almost affectionate. We need to talk. He forced himself to stay calm, his mind calculating every possible escape. About what? Victoria took a slow sip of wine. About loyalty, about the little meetings you've been having, about that flash drive in your pocket. His stomach dropped. You've been digging, she continued, and I really hoped you wouldn't. I wanted to believe you were smarter than that. She picked up the gun. Now, love, she murmured, leveling it at him. Tell me, what am I supposed to do with you? Malcolm didn't move. The weight of the gun in Victoria's hand turned the air razor thin, pressing against his lungs like a vice. His mind raced, every survival instinct screaming at him to stay calm, stay still. One wrong move, one wrong word, and this could be the end. Victoria sighed, tilting her head as if disappointed. You were doing so well, Malcolm, playing the part, keeping your head down, but then you started asking questions. She swirled the wine in her glass, her manicured fingers light against the stem, and now here we are. His throat was dry, but he forced himself to speak. You don't want to do this. Victoria arched a brow. Don't I? You're too smart for that, Malcolm said carefully. You don't kill people recklessly. You make sure everything is neat, controlled. He gestured slowly, his fingers grazing the flash drive in his pocket. And if you kill me, this doesn't go away. Chris knows. If I disappear, people will come looking. For the first time, something flickered in Victoria's eyes. A crack. She exhaled and set the gun down on the table, but the tension didn't ease. You always were clever, she murmured. That's why I chose you. Malcolm's stomach twisted. Chose me? Victoria leaned back, crossing her legs. You think this marriage was about love? About companionship? She laughed softly. No, Malcolm. It was about control. Your father was a problem, a loose end. Jonathan tried to handle it, but things got messy. Malcolm's hands curled into fists. Messy? You mean you had him killed? Victoria's expression remained unreadable. I mean, he got too close to something that didn't concern him, just like you. His pulse thundered in his ears. His father had known something dangerous enough that Jonathan had tried to silence him, and when that failed, Victoria did. He forced himself to stay steady. Why me, Victoria? Why marry me? She smiled, slow and deliberate. Because I knew one day you'd start looking. I knew you'd want to understand your father's past. And what better way to keep an eye on you than to keep you in my bed? A chill crept up Malcolm's spine. This had never been about love, not even about power. It had been about owning him, but she had underestimated him. He straightened, forcing his voice to stay calm. You're right, he said. I did start looking, and I found things, enough to bury you if they ever got out. Victoria's eyes darkened, but her smirk didn't fade. And what exactly do you plan to do with that information, Malcolm? He met her gaze, steady, unwavering. Whatever I have to. Silence stretched between them. Then Victoria let out a quiet chuckle. Well then, she murmured, finishing her wine. I suppose this just got interesting. Malcolm didn't relax. The game had changed, but it was far from over. Malcolm knew he had to move fast. Victoria wasn't. The type to let things spiral out of control. If she had let him walk away from that conversation, it was because she had already decided how to eliminate him on her terms. He needed to strike first. That night, he locked himself in the study and plugged the flash drive into his laptop. Files opened in rapid succession, financial records, wire transfers, and finally, a sealed deposition from a man named Richard Cole, a former Blackwell associate. Malcolm skimmed the first few paragraphs, his heart pounding. Jonathan Blackwell was guilty of more than just fraud. According to Cole, Jonathan had been laundering money for some very dangerous people, and when he tried to cut ties, they silenced him. But the real shock came in the final paragraphs. They had help. Cole didn't name names directly, but the implications were clear. Jonathan hadn't just been murdered, he had been betrayed from the inside, and Victoria, as his wife, had been the only one with unrestricted access to his personal and financial dealings. Malcolm exhaled sharply. She had orchestrated it. She had made sure her husband wouldn't walk away alive, and now she was doing the same to him. He needed proof, something undeniable. A plan began to form in his mind. He knew Victoria well enough to understand her weaknesses, her confidence, her arrogance. She believed she had already won, which meant she would let her guard down just enough. So Malcolm set the trap. The next morning, he approached Victoria in the grand sitting room, feigning exhaustion. You were right, he said, voice heavy. I should have never started digging. Victoria, lounging on the velvet sofa, arched a brow. Oh, I was stupid, Malcolm continued, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us. He hesitated, letting the vulnerability sink in. If you tell me the truth, just between us, I can let it go. We can move forward. Victoria studied him, and for the first time he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Curiosity, calculation. She rose from her seat and walked toward him, placing a hand on his cheek. Oh, Malcolm, she murmured. You never had a choice. His stomach twisted as she leaned in, her lips close to his ear. Jonathan thought he could control me too, she whispered. Look where that got him. Malcolm swallowed. So you did kill him? Victoria pulled back, smiling. Of course I did. He pressed stop on his phone's voice recorder, tucked neatly inside his pocket. Her smirk faded. For the first time since this game had begun, Victoria Blackwell realized she had made a mistake. Malcolm stepped back, gripping his phone like a weapon. Game over, he said. Victoria's expression darkened, but she wasn't done yet. Not even close. Victoria's face remained unreadable, but Malcolm saw the shift. The moment she registered her mistake. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and she hated it. You think you've won, she murmured, stepping forward, slow, deliberate. Malcolm didn't flinch. I don't think, Victoria. I know. He turned the phone screen toward her, pressing play. Her own words crackled through the speaker. Jonathan thought he could control me too. Look where that got him. Victoria's lips parted slightly, the first real sign of shock he had ever seen on her face. But it was gone just as fast, replaced by cold calculation. And what do you plan to do with that, love? She asked, her voice steady, measured. Take it to the police? You think a recording will be enough to bring me down? Malcolm had anticipated this. It's already been sent out, he lied. Chris, an investigative journalist, a law firm. Hell, I even sent a copy to an anonymous tip line. You try to touch me, Victoria, and this goes public. He watched for any sign of weakness, a flicker of uncertainty, a hesitation. Victoria smiled. It chilled him to the bone. Well played, she said softly. Then she turned and threw her wine glass against the wall. The shattering sound echoed through the penthouse. The doors burst open within seconds. Two of her security guards stormed in, hands resting on their holsters. Malcolm's stomach twisted. Victoria tilted her head toward him. "My husband seems to be in distress," she said smoothly. "He's been acting irrationally, making threats." The guards moved closer. Malcolm's pulse thundered. She was turning the game on him. If she framed him as unstable, it wouldn't matter what evidence he had. "Back off!" Malcolm snapped, stepping away. "I swear to God, I'll take this to the authorities." Victoria exhaled, shaking her head in mock pity. "Oh, Malcolm," she sighed. "You still don't understand. I own the authorities." She was right. She had judges in her pocket, police chiefs on speed dial. If he didn't play this right, she would bury him before he ever had the chance to fight back. But Malcolm had one last move. "Maybe you do own the system," he said, "but you don't own the public." Victoria narrowed her eyes. Malcolm lifted his phone. "This conversation is being live-streamed." The color drained from her face. He turned the screen toward her. Thousands of viewers were watching. Comments flooded in. Did she just confess? Who is this woman? Blackwell murder exposed? It was too late for her to silence him. For the first time, Victoria Blackwell had lost. Malcolm took a step forward, staring into her eyes. "Game over," he said again. This time she knew it was true. Victoria didn't speak. She didn't move. For the first time since Malcolm had met her, she had no control over the situation. The power had shifted and she knew it. Outside, the world was already reacting. The live stream had gone viral, headlines flashing across news outlets within minutes. Billionaire widow caught confessing to husband's murder. Victoria Blackwell exposed in real time. Shocking revelation. There was no covering this up. No amount of money or influence could make this disappear. The security guards hesitated, looking at Victoria for direction, but she just stood there, seething in silence. Then, as if finally accepting the inevitable, she exhaled, smoothing out the fabric of her dress. When she looked at Malcolm again, there was no rage, no fear, just calm resignation. "Well," she said softly, "this is inconvenient." Malcolm didn't lower his phone. "It's over, Victoria. You don't get to walk away from this." Her lips twitched in something almost like amusement. "You still don't understand how this world works, do you?" She took a slow step forward, her eyes steady. "Even now, even when you think you've won, I can still destroy you." Malcolm knew she was bluffing, or at least he hoped she was. But before either of them could say another word, sirens wailed outside. Victoria's gaze flickered toward the window, and Malcolm saw it, the first crack in her armor. The doors burst open. Police officers flooded the room, weapons drawn. "Victoria Blackwell," one of them called. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and multiple financial crimes." For the first time, she looked truly cornered. Malcolm stepped back as the officers swarmed her. Victoria didn't resist. She didn't scream. She just smiled. As they cuffed her hands behind her back, she turned her gaze to Malcolm one last time. "You really think this is over?" she whispered. A shiver crawled up his spine. Then, just like that, they led her away. Malcolm stood in the wreckage of the life he had nearly been trapped in, breathing hard. It was finally done. The world would know the truth. But as he looked at the shattered glass, the abandoned wealth, the remnants of a life he had been pulled into, he knew this was only the beginning. The Blackwell empire would crumble. But some legacies don't die so easily. Malcolm had survived. Now it was time to decide what to do next. The trial was a spectacle. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse. News anchors dissected every detail, and the world watched as Victoria Blackwell, the woman who once held untouchable power, was brought to her knees. Malcolm sat in the courtroom, watching as the prosecution tore apart the pristine image Victoria had spent decades crafting. Her secrets unraveled one by one. The fraudulent businesses, the offshore accounts, the bribed officials, everything she had built was crumbling in real time. But it was the murder charge that sealed her fate. The jury only needed 3 hours to deliberate. Guilty. The word rang through the courtroom, a death knell to Victoria's empire. She sat motionless as the verdict was read, her expression unreadable. When the judge sentenced her to life without parole, she finally turned to look at Malcolm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The promise in her eyes was clear. This wasn't the end. Even from a prison cell, Victoria Blackwell would never truly disappear. But Malcolm wasn't afraid. For the first time in his life, he was free. He didn't take a dime from Victoria's frozen assets. The lawyers had offered, insisting he had every right to claim part of her estate, but he refused. Instead, he did something she never would have expected. He turned the Blackwell fortune into something meaningful. Months later, Malcolm stood in front of a newly unveiled plaque outside the city's most prestigious law school, the Jonathan Blackwell Memorial Scholarship Fund. It wasn't about Jonathan, not really. It was about the people Victoria had used, the lives she had ruined. Malcolm wanted to take the very thing she had hoarded, power, wealth, influence, and use it to help people like himself, people who had been left behind. A young woman approached him, eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Carter?" she said, hesitating. Malcolm smiled. "Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "This scholarship, it's going to change my life." Malcolm nodded, the weight of everything settling into place. "Then it's worth it." She smiled, then disappeared into the crowd. He took a deep breath, letting it all sink in. The scandal, the lies, the near-death experiences, everything he had endured had led to this moment. He had beaten Victoria Blackwell at her own game, and now he was finally writing his own future. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A private number. His stomach tightened. He hesitated, then answered. A familiar voice whispered through the line, "Did you really think it would be that easy?" The call ended. Malcolm's grip tightened around the phone, his heartbeat steady. Victoria was gone, but the game was never over.